nga ngorna ya tochi shwe internet de shiri kanu ngur sirla phesha thana shi tembe dodanga warap yala ene shanda chik ngazu senju shungge minaka de peyuna sangmaya phebaya tochi shwe enteda chepchi zebede library ki ngai di keshe di thadina ya ning taban tochi shwe in the chosen the library ki ngaya de ki kharsuta guest room yage kangbo ka buchimut na ya nangje desan shira kibudu cheza denzu tole ya thadi na ya mun ning thabane tuchi shuyo ani tida talhenge sangma yange gongta shui khaisen nge gi richi kangzi ti inge thoni chesa ti inge thoni pa mashurang shuri tugudu tinda sunza talhenge sangma gongta shui. So I'm going to begin my presentation. And before I begin my presentation, let me make a bit of clarification in the sense that in case you are here expecting that I might be sharing with you my completed research project, please don't feel disappointed. I have yet to get to that completion stage. I'm actually at the very beginning stage of my research project. So tonight my presentation includes 4 sections. As a part of my first section, I'm going to share with you a little bit of a background information so that you get to know why and how I developed this interest on Tibetan nationalism. And associated with this particular background information, I'm also going to share with you just 2 I wonder questions. And the second I wonder question, that really relates to the schooling of Tibetan children in the diaspora. And then this I wonder question nicely leads to my second section of my research presentation tonight. That is really, I'm going to share with you my current research project, which includes research purpose and research questions, which are really aligned with my research purpose. And these research questions are eventually going to guide my entire research process and project. And then I'm going to share with you just my first section of this research project, particularly sharing with you my, how I develop questions pertaining to my interview process. And then third section is, since it is dealing with Tibetan nationalism, I had to read quite a bit of work just to get a sense of what are the important constructs associated with nationalism in general, and then, of course, Tibetan nationalism in very specific terms. And finally, my fourth section is going to be just a very rough, I would say, themes that I'm going to share with you, themes that seem to emerge from my very initial rudimentary kind of like observation based on interviews that I've conducted so far, particularly with the former education ministers. And just this afternoon, I completed my interview with our Shiri Kanu Ngudusirla. In terms of my background information, I have been very strongly influenced by the works of a French cultural anthropologist. Her name is Véronique Binet. She had come to India towards late 1990s to study particularly communal violence associated with Muslims and Hindus in Maharashtra. But her research focus was very different. She didn't want to really focus on the spontaneous eruptions of communal violence or the aftermath, but she really wanted to focus in terms of what takes place, particularly in the classroom situations, activities that might lead to this aggressive sort of like project. So, and then, of course, she was also very interested in terms of, I want to say, this was actually a departure from the existing research studies. Most of existing research studies, they tend to focus on the aftermath, the spontaneous eruptions of communal violence. So while she was visiting Urdu schools and the Hindi language-based schools in Maharashtra, a war broke out between India and Pakistan. It was called Kargil War, which lasted, I would say, from 3 to 4 months. And because of this war actually offered her an additional opportunity to study as to how educational processes are involved in the manufacture and production of national identity in the schooling process. And she was engaged in very thorough observation. She meticulously documented all the activities taking place in the classroom situations. And what she finally concluded, I thought was very interesting. She recognized that children were phenomenologically, through the lived experiences, to feel the nation within their bodies. So production and manufacture of national identity takes place very early, as early as kindergarten and primary grades, based on her research project done in India towards the end of 1990s. And then, of course, she used this very particular concept called structures of feeling. How are the structures of feeling, they come to play a role in the manufacture and production of national identity. And look at the way she really approach her research questions. She was interested as to how structures of feeling are harnessed in the everyday school activities. How are these everyday activities are produced, reshaped, and reinterpreted by social actors like teachers and students and parents. So these structures of feeling is really a somatic concept. And so she used, as I was telling you earlier, she observed minutiae of daily life that was taking place in the classroom situation. And not only that, she also observed extracurricular activities like field trips and chanting and parent-teacher conferences and things like that. So what we could say at this point is all the activities that she had observed could be collectively called as artifacts of nationalism, cultural artifacts of nationalism. So this is really a very good term that really captures in terms of what she had observed and documented, particularly looking at the activities taking place on a daily basis in the classroom context. So you got a sense of what she was noticing in the classrooms in Maharashtra, particularly when this war was taking place. Children were drawing anti-military folks shooting down Pakistani military folks, and they were also drawing pictures in which they would have Indian national flag hosted on the map of this thing, Pakistan map. So you can get a sense that children were involved at very early age in terms of demonization of the other, particularly in this case, Pakistan. And so then, this led me to the next I wonder question. I began to wonder as to how children might be involved in Pakistan in terms of their national identity development. To what extent the schooling process plays a role in the national identity production and manufacture. So I did some research and I looked around, and I was a little bit disappointed in the fact that there were very few research studies. And I think one can understand easily why this is the case. I'm sure Pakistan does not allow a lot of foreigners to come and engage in research in their classrooms and things like that. So there were very few classroom-based research involving children. Luckily, I did come across one research study. That was actually a very thoroughly implemented research study. And this was done by Durrani and Dunn in 2010. So what they did was they explored the links between religion and nationalism in 4 state schools. So I'm emphasizing this word state. So these were not private schools, these were like state schools in some province of Pakistan. And so in this research, religion was used as a boundary marker between the Muslim self and the Hindu, the non-Muslim, the other. And then they were kind of quite shocked. A lot of these social studies textbooks, they described wars between Hindus and Muslims going over many, many years at several different points in history. And in all these battles, the Muslims were portrayed as victorious, passionate, masculine, whereas Hindus were portrayed as cowardly, feminine, defeatist. So again, you, I think, begin to get a sense that there is, again, demonization of the other taking place even as early as 4th grade. So then while I was doing this research, I was also quite surprised to find that there were very few classroom-based research studies that looked at the issue of national identity development, particularly in the schooling process. And this is one reason why I was really determined to carry out this research in the Tibetan schooling diaspora situation. And then this led me to the next I wonder question, that is with regard to the schooling of Tibetan children in the diaspora schools. And of course, when I did some research, there was not a single research done that looked at the Tibetan nationalism that might be promoted or cultivated or, in the schooling process. Not a single research, at least I did not come across. So then what happened is, I looked at our, basic educational policy in exile. I was hoping that this will shed some light in terms of my research interest. And of course, really, I was quite surprised that there was not even mention of the word mainland China in that narrative. Forget about reclaiming the lost nation. Forget about, fighting for freedom, things like that. So this kind of narratives are not at all included in the basic policy document. What was very clear was the principle of altruism was very strongly embedded in this particular policy document. And in fact, this seems to be the driving force in terms of reinforcing Tibetan national identity. And then I looked at a couple of objectives and goals embedded in the Tibetan basic education policy. Look at some of these goals. Education must emphasize the need to embrace the other beings as more precious than the self and sacrificing the self for the service and welfare of other persons. Well, when I read this, little bit paid more attention, I think we are being asked, am I right, through this document, that we must consider Chinese more important than the Tibetans. And I hope you are able to really accept this kind of position. It was a little bit intriguing for me. And then this was the only one situation where I found the word political. A political goal of the Tibetan people is to instill in all the Tibetan races of the 3 provinces the principles of unity, freedom, democracy, rule of law, nonviolence, truth, and justice. And finally, the ultimate goal is to transform the whole of 3 provinces of Tibet into the zone of nonviolence, peace, to transform Tibetan society into a nonviolent society, and to lead other people onto the path of nonviolence and compassion. So if these are the goals embedded in the educational document, and if this is what we imagine the future Tibet to be, of course it makes a lot of sense that the future leaders and citizens of Tibet must be prepared in the classrooms of today. This was very clear. So hence, the purpose of my research is really to look at the intersection of secular ethics, which reinforces the concept of inner values and compassion, kindness, forgiveness, and things like that, and the middle way approach designed to solve the Sino-Tibetan issue and the production of Tibetan nationalism. So based on this purpose of the research, I developed 3 research questions, which are aligned, in fact, with my research purpose. And these are the research questions that are going to guide my future research project, as well as analysis, observation, and of course, my interview as well. So my first research question is, in view of the continued occupation of Tibet by mainland China, what are the challenges and opportunities of sustaining a healthy development of altruistic attitudes, dispositions, and the continued affirmation of middle way approach as a way to resolve Sino-Tibetan issue, and of course the promotion of Tibetan nationalism in the schooling process. And so I came to Dharamsala particularly to address this research question as a part of my first phase of my research project. And look at my second research question: what classroom rituals and discourse practices cultivate disposition, skills, and attitudes for the construction and reproduction of a compassionate classroom culture leading to inclusive Tibetan nationalism in exile. So I'm going to be engaged in classroom observations next year. And as a part of my classroom observation, I'm going to collect artifacts. I'm going to interview, hopefully, teachers and students and engage in observation. At least I'll be collecting 3 different types of data in order to really get a sense of to what extent all these lofty ideas embedded in the Tibetan basic education policy are being reflected, implemented, manifested in the classroom situation. My third research question has to do with to what extent do these cultural artifacts that I'm going to collect as a part of my second phase of the research question, to what extent are they associated with secular ethics, middle way approach, and Tibetan nationalism? Do these artifacts complement each other, or do they contradict each other to some extent? So these are my 3 research questions. So I am at my first phase of a research project. All right, now let me just go over my interview or questionnaire development. So I gave a lot of thinking to my interview research questions. Initially, there were like 10 or 11 research questions, and I thought they were like too many. So I had to kind of like cut them down a little bit, and then went back and forth. I would say it was a cyclic process. It took me almost 2 weeks to finally say to myself, I am happy with my interview questions. It wasn't a really easy process. I went back and forth. Basically, what I did was I made sure that whatever interview questions I would develop, they would definitely address my first research question. I want to make sure that they are ultimately linked to my first research question. And then, of course, the development of my interview questionnaire was not just kind of like haphazardly or done. I wanted to make sure that my interview process development was informed by certain concepts. So the concepts of socialization really helped me a lot. In the sense, when children are socialized in the classroom setting with these values, attitudes, dispositions, of course, they're likely to internalize them. And hence, schools and classrooms play a very important role in terms of the promotion and the production and manufacture of Tibetan national identity. And then, of course, my research is also based on this fundamental premise that when children are socialized, socialization is a very sort of like a generic term, and I'm using this here. In a very compassionate learning environment, they're likely to develop altruistic attitudes and dispositions. So these 2 sort of like, I would say, elements really guided the process of my interview questionnaire development. And then, since Tibetan nationalism is a very big part of my research agenda, and when I came to Dharamsala on July 4th, I sort of like was running around trying to make sure that I'm able to get in touch with the former education ministers, and if I was able to, at least set an interview date and things like that. And then I, of course, began to read literature on middle way. There are plenty of literature. And then, of course, secular ethics. But then I was very surprised there were very few literature on Tibetan nationalism. And then I was a little bit kind of like jolted when I realized that I was academically ill-prepared. I had no idea. I read a little bit, but not to the extent that I was well-informed, let alone Tibetan nationalism, but even the general concept of nationalism itself and its relationship to history, political science, sociology, anthropology. And so I hurriedly came down to the library here and asked the reference section, do you have some books on Tibetan nationalism or some other nationalism? And they gave me a stack of books. So I spent almost 2 days going through and flipping the pages and trying to really figure out, are there some constructs that might be relevant to my research and that might shed some light when I engage in the analysis, content analysis of my interview. So this is what I found. There was only one book on Tibetan nationalism with the same title by a person, Klager, I think. And first I got very excited when I found this book. This was written somewhere in the 1990s. And actually some Tibetans had helped him in the field work. And then I read the pages here and there, and I was a little bit disappointed because what this scholar did was he looked at one just element, the concept of patronage, manjus and things like that. To what extent this concept of patronage played a role in the Tibetan identity construction. So very quickly I discarded this book. And then there were a few other books that sort of like dealt with history of nationalism, pertaining to different countries, and in fact going back to several thousands of years. And I sort of like flipped through the pages, and I didn't find those very useful for me. And then there was a small book written by a scholar, R.K. Minago, and it's called Nationalism. I flipped through the pages, and of course looked at the content. And really, he offered, for example, definition of nationalism. So I need to really inform myself, am I right? I need to have a clear sense of what is this concept of nationalism before I talk about Tibetan nationalism. And then he also offered typologies of nationalism. And then he offered like stages of nationalism development, which I found very intriguing and interesting. And I actually took notes for myself. And then, of course, I was looking for late Professor Nawang B's works. I looked at his PhD thesis, in which he really explored the concept of Marxism and nationalism. Really explored in depth, very comprehensive. But I was disappointed. There's no mention of Tibetan nationalism, not at all. And then I read his other book, Tibet Road Ahead, and of course, there wasn't a whole lot. There wasn't really not a section on Tibetan nationalism. Then he wrote a book in 1992, which I found very, very useful. So I'm going to share some of the things that he shared in that book. It's called Culture and the Politics of Third World Nationalism. So again, I was very excited, thinking that you might mention Tibetan nationalism, and I was looking through the pages and index and a table of again, there wasn't a single mention of Tibetan nationalism. He did talk about Marxism and nationalism, things like particularly as they relate to the third world. Again, third world was the term he had used. But of course, these days we might use the term developing countries. Am I right? Third world sounds like, on one extreme you have this highly developed, and on the other end you have this really less developed, and then the third world somewhere struggling in the middle really sounds very condensing, so I anyway. So this is what I found. In terms of the definition, I actually used the definition offered by Minago. He says, nationalism is a political movement which seeks to attain and defend an objective we may call national integrity. It is often inspired by collective grievances against an oppressor. So I paid particular attention to this term, attain and defend. So I was thinking about our own Tibetan situation. Let's imagine we're able to really, attain the goals of middle way approach. And we all return to this beautiful Tibet at some point. But then if we aren't able to defend what we have attained, then what we have attained could be easily lost so quickly. So I was really kind of intrigued why he chose this to attain and to defend. So I think we can learn something from this definition as well. The next one is, again, he included this definition in his book by Alport. I have read a lot of works of Gordon Alport. He was a very well-known scholar in the United States of America. He spent a lot of his time looking at race relations and prejudice development and things. So I've read a lot of his works. So when I found the definition, that he offered, conditioned obedience to authority. Of course, when he used the term authority, it was very problematic for me. I don't want to be obedient to some authority that I have no respect for. I hope in our case, it will be obedience to ideals, inner values, and things like that. So, I just want to kind of make that as a thought. And then this was really very interesting. Professor Nawang B, he talked about this structure of nationalism. In terms of this structure, he talked about two aspects to the structure of nationalism. One is traditional dimension, which is really like, conventional categories that we normally use in terms of national identity, based on race, language, religion, tradition, and things. These are very, very commonly used categories. And I wasn't sure as to why he said this, but he said this kind of a nationalism is far more common in the third world countries. I have yet to come across the reason for this, but this is what he said. And then the second one is the kind of nationalism based on egalitarian ideology, based on notion of equality, freedom and fraternity. And he said this kind of a nationalism is most commonly found in the Western countries. So then when I looked at these two aspects of the structure of nationalism, I realized that the Tibetan situation does not fit into either of them very neatly. So I think there is opportunity for us to develop this third perspective. And for lack of better term, I use the term transcendental identification, based on principles of inner value, interdependence, universal responsibility, and shared humanity, all based on the ideas shared by His Holiness. So I think as a Tibetan, we have this wonderful opportunity to offer an alternative to these two existing aspects of the structure of nationalism. Now, I've gone over the structures of nationalism, and then, he talked about these three dimensions for each of the structure. One is the tradition. So tradition connects a nation with the past, is a source of inspiration, and also it provides that glue that sort of like binds the community together. And so thinking about our Tibetan situation, I think we have a very rich cultural heritage. That really provides this, really, I would say, endless source of inspiration. And that it really binds not only the Tibetan community, but a lot of people who are interested in Buddhism. Am I right? Including our Chinese brothers and sisters. And the third dimension is called interest. And this primarily includes cultural and economic sort of like elements. And this is supposed to connect with the present situation. And not only that, this is supposed to be providing incentives for solving social problems. So then I was thinking about, interests that may pertain to our Tibetan situation. And of course, we have a lot of issues that require immediate solution, like, lack of human rights, a lack of linguistic rights, lack of religious rights, and of course, environmental destruction taking place in Tibet. So I think these are very serious issues of interest for us. Am I right? Very serious issues. So the last one is called ideals. It's mostly political. That is what late Professor Nawang B designated this ideal as. Connects to the future, yet to be shaped and formed according to ideals. So then I realized, our middle way approach really provides an excellent strategy to resolve Sino-Tibetan issue. And so, so we do have the traditions, we do have really interests that require immediate solution, immediate attention, and the ideals. Am I right? Ideals. All these three aspects are very much present in our situation. And this is what he said. When a movement is in crisis, it brings all these elements together as a potent, complex compound. So then I was thinking about our own situation. I think we have already reached the tipping point. Am I right? Based on what is taking place in Tibet. I mean, really, already we have reached this critical stage, definitely. So we should be looking at this complex, compound situation, really. Now, this was something very intriguing that I found when I read his book. He said, based on single-pointed meditation on nationalism. So I have this evidence that Professor late Nawang B, he engaged in single-pointed meditation, not necessarily on emptiness, but on nationalism. And so what he found after this meditation, hopefully under a Buddha tree, neither Marxism nor revolution can quite match the sheer potency and mass appeal of nationalism. I was very intrigued by this statement. So my question to ourselves is, can Tibetan nationalism master such potency and mass appeal? Can we master secular ethics, middle way, Tibetan nationalism to forge, coalesce such a potent, complex, synergistic powerhouse? So this takes me to my interview, which really gave me some hope. So what I'm sharing with you is very, very tentative. I haven't had time to go through the entire, interview, nor have I had the time to transcribe and translate and things like that, which are going to take a lot of time. But since I was listening, when I was recording my interviews on my computer, so I was making notes sometimes. But even if I was not making notes, I was registering, some important concepts and things like that in my mind. And so what I found was the folks, the people that I interviewed, there was really a consensus that secular ethics, middle way approach, and Tibetan nationalism can coexist very beautifully. In fact, they should. That was one consensus. And then Tibetan nationalism must include middle way approach and compassionate attitude and disposition. That was also a very commonly shared perspective. And then this was also shared by a former Khalun. The merging of these three dimensions allow us to be known and appreciated all over the world. Tibet will exist forever if we remain true to our ideals espoused by His Holiness. So again, a little bit of a transcendental orientation in this concept, in this perspective. And then one former education minister, she was very empathetic. She said, we must include the denial of human rights in Tibet as a part of our collective grievances, as a part of Tibetan nationalism. And then she did say this very, very clearly. The lack of human rights is a very serious matter. If the Tibetans are suffering due to lack of human rights, then we must do in terms of how can we make sure that they have access to human rights. So for this particular interviewee, piece of land wasn't as important as the rights enjoyed by the Tibetans in Tibet. So compassion, kindness, nonviolence are core aspects of our identity and nationalism. So this was also a very commonly shared perspective. And I think this is also something that we must keep in mind. I'm not suggesting that nationalism is not important. Nationalism is very, very important. But it doesn't have to be developed and cultivated in terms of demonizing the other. In fact, it can be very inclusive, kind of nationalism. And another aspect that was shared in my interview was that language must become a very important facet of Tibetan nationalism, because the language is the vessel that holds the Tibetan rich cultural heritage. So there was a huge emphasis on this. And then this is sort of like my, should I say, a little bit of a summary. An inclusive nationalism grounded in altruism is essential for the success and continued success of middle way approach in and outside of Tibet. So this is something I realized, after reading books on middle way approach and secular ethics, and then of course after engaging in interviews with some decision makers. And then in the library I found this book, Tibetan Identity Views of Young Tibetans. It was published by our Department of Education. What they did is they asked the Tibetan youth to describe how do they define themselves as a Tibetan, what is their perspective, perception, and things like that. And I'm sure these Tibetan youths have gone through the schooling process in the diaspora. So if I may say, the proof of the pudding lies in the eating. Then, the kinds of values, perspectives that these Tibetan youth hold are indicative of what kind of educational experiences are being provided in the Tibetan schooling setting. Look at this. This is what Penden Sonam from New Delhi is a direct quote. It is holding on to our traditions and culture, upholding the ways and values of life which make us Tibetan. A completely different people regardless of any external recognition. So for him, all these externally based definitions of nationalism, race and religion, things are not very important, but the value that one upholds. Then this was, I think, by the same Tibetan youth. We need Tibetans who can stand for identity, even after getting hammered down time and again. This value-laden identity gives us the strength to bear these blows. So what he was suggesting is that, Tibetan nationalism, which is really based on love and compassion, helps us to overcome very difficult situations in life. Then I was looking at this particular Tibetan youth, and I really kind of sense his struggle. He was asking all these questions to himself in terms of defining his Tibetan identity. I hope you can also get this sort of like the urgency and the kind of a struggle that he was going through. So he asks this number of questions to himself. Is it my personality that made me a Tibetan? Am I Tibetan because I was born in Tibet? Am I Tibetan because my father was Tibetan? Am I Tibetan because I speak Tibetan language? Am I Tibetan because I've been brought up in Tibetan culture? Am I Tibetan because I am religious? And so at the end, he repeats this question because he wasn't able to find a proper answer to his multiple questions. And he leaves us with this little bit of suspense. At the end, he says, it is more than all of this. So my hunch is that, principles of inner value espoused in the secular ethics, I hope they're the ones that is eventually going to define his Tibetan identity. So these are some of the references that I use, particularly for my concept on Tibetan nationalism. Let me see what else I can say. Yeah, so I have just barely completed my first phase of the research. And so I'm going to end here rather than going over my second phase of the research, which is not relevant for this presentation. And so at this point, I am willing to entertain questions, either in Tibetan language or hopefully in English. Any that Congo Karsu Kandinaya Narangone was a Pibe Gashing Tolia, Mixeg, Shimjurep in the Chiagi, Cheshi Besunda. Zabenge and the research is Tony, then they did a tagger of Javachagutu. Any that research Luniver the Kablia, Lobda Kanal, Zinana Chinche, Shungizolia, Tagger Gageti, Consusenal Cardo. Consege Pibe Gashin the Conditional Musichiguto. Rival, and did any consolia chick, Tindeg, Kun, Peggy Tayag, Tomlin the candidate good, consonant chigina, and land the consonant a 7 younger Samudo. Tandang Ejik Tashago Sugar, it might be totally opposite. So I'm hoping that I'm going to learn a lot when I go to the classroom situations and engage in conversations with Tibetan children. To what extent do they see are the important elements of Tibetan nationalism? What needs to take place in the classroom situation in order to promote Tibetan nationalism? And China, children are the best source for guidance. They have this very sort of like unbiased. They have less baggage than you and I have. So whatever they tell you, that's a very honest response to your question. So I'm hoping that I will learn a lot from our beautiful Tibetan children studying in different schools. They will tell us how should we promote Tibetan nationalism. What is the most effective way to promote Tibetan nationalism? And so I will be sharing the outcomes of my observation, my collection of artifacts, and interviews with teachers and students. I think that will really, help us to paint a picture, some kind of portrait, what Tibetan nationalism should look like in the future. And the council is now doing reaction to shoes years and dig Tone Shindo Younger Sungorva, Gashing Lare, and the column numbers or conditions and consequent Tarasung, and the Pubeki, Gashing, Tavenale, Nevado, and the reaction to Mamdi, Kajudi, Nevado, Jego, the Sung Naso, Tilla, Kajadama Peche. Karsu yiji yus shuyi, and Titan Shungi Zolia, that Zina Mabutone, that ding is some detangorva. She's at the marketing war. Tinda Susan Yang Consolia Tamlan, the chick Shandaj Gugum or some too. Lagwada Sosi Lumbe Shingla Soba, Shingna, 엔다나시 심제 엔데네 갈수 리 flora and fauna and 다가나시 셰로서 된수베 중중토니야 콘즈가 초베나리아 슈크심부지 러비나 사덴다 마서 야부팅 유즈네 인디토래 이는 안주그리 슝그티 갈수그리 넘버지되고이나 시부지 템보 야구 시부지 용그리 삼르도. So thank you very much for being here and listening to my presentation.